What would you do if you had lost everything? Your home, your family, your name, and all you had left were $3 silver and the clothes on your back. For 19-year-old Etta Sloan, this wasn't a question. It was the sharp-edged reality of her life in the autumn of 1882. She paid those last $3 for a deed to a pile of forgotten stones and rotten timbers. Everyone called the Blackwater Ruin an abandoned water mill on the edge of nowhere. They laughed at her, a girl buying a ghost. But the truth waiting inside, buried under the weight of a forgotten world, was a secret that would not only restore her name, but rewrite the history of the entire valley. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell the story of the girl who bought a ruin and found a kingdom. The dust of the road had settled into the very weave of her dress, a fine red grit that felt like a second skin. Etta Sloan walked with a steadiness that belied the tremor in her heart, her worn-out boots scuffing softly on the packed earth of Hollow Creek's Main Street. She kept her eyes forward, fixed on the hazy ridgeline that cupped the town, avoiding the curious and pitying glances from the doorways of the general store and the saloon. She knew what they saw. A girl too young to be so alone, her face smudged with fatigue, her father's old canvas satchel slung over a shoulder that seemed too slight to carry its meager weight. Inside was a spare shirt, a whetstone, a half-empty tin of coffee, and the heavy, invisible burden of grief. Her father, John Sloan, had been a miller, a man whose hands were always dusted with the fine, pale powder of his trade. He smelled of flour, sawdust, and honest work. He had taught her the language of the millstone, the song of the water wheel, the heft of a well-balanced tool. Then Silas Blackwood's bank had called in a note no one knew existed, and their world had crumbled like dry, rotted wood. The mill was lost, then the house, and then, as if his heart could no longer bear the weight of a life's work undone, her father was gone too. She had buried him in a quiet churchyard, 2 counties over, a simple wooden cross, her only monument to a life of substance. Now she was here, drawn by the whisper of a place where a person could disappear, or perhaps begin again. Her father's last words to her had been a fevered murmur, his eyes looking past her back in time. "The foundation," he'd whispered, his hand fluttering at his chest. "Always check the foundation." She had thought it the ramblings of a dying man. Now, with nothing left, the words echoed with a strange and desperate weight. She had just enough money for a week's lodging and a few meals, and then she didn't let her mind venture that far. She passed the smithy, the air thick with the rhythmic clang of hammer on steel and the sharp scent of quenched metal. A group of men stood near the land office, laughing over something. Their laughter was loud, careless, the sound of men with full pockets and easy futures. One of them, a portly man in a waistcoat, too tight for his frame, pointed a thumb over his shoulder toward the dark woods that climbed the mountain. "Heard old man Hemlock finally sold the deed to the Blackwater Ruin," he boomed. $3, can you imagine? Paying good money for a pile of wet rocks and splinters. The others chuckled. The man was Silas Blackwood. Etta's breath caught in her throat. She froze, half hidden by the corner of the livery stable, her knuckles white where she gripped the strap of her satchel. It was him, the man who had taken everything, the man whose name her father had cursed with his final ragged breaths. She listened, her body rigid, the dust and the distance of her journey falling away, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. The world narrowed to that man's mocking voice and the object of his scorn. A worthless, abandoned mill, a place no one wanted, a place forgotten by everyone but the ghosts. And in that moment a seed of an idea, desperate and wild, took root in the barren soil of her grief. A ruin, a mill, a foundation. Etta spent that night in the cheapest boarding house in Hollow Creek, a cramped room under the eaves that smelled of boiled cabbage and old linen. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat by the single window, watching the moon trace a silver path across the unfamiliar rooftops. her father's last words turning over and over in her mind. The foundation. Always check the foundation. In the pale, pre-dawn light, she made her decision. It wasn't a choice born of hope, but of necessity. It was the only thing in the world she could afford. She washed her face in the cold basin, tied her hair back with a piece of twine, and walked out into the morning chill before the town was fully awake. The county clerk's office was a small, dusty room filled with the scent of aging paper and dry ink. A thin man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose looked up from a massive ledger, his expression a mixture of boredom and impatience. "Yes?" he asked, his voice reedy. Etta's own voice was quiet but steady. "I've come about a deed." She placed her 3 silver dollars on the polished wood of the counter. The coins were worn smooth, the last physical remnants of her old life. They made a small, definitive sound in the quiet room. The one for the old Blackwater Mill property. The clerk blinked. He looked from her young, earnest face to the coins, and then a slow smile spread across his lips. It was not a kind smile. "The Blackwater ruin?" he said, drawing out the last word as if savoring a private joke. "Child, you don't want that. The roof's gone, the wheels seized, and the creek floods it every spring. It's not worth the paper the deed is printed on." "I'll take it," Etta said, her gaze unwavering. The clerk shrugged, the smile turning into a smirk. He shuffled through a stack of loose papers in a dusty cubbyhole marked unclaimed and forfeit. He pulled one out, yellowed and creased, and smoothed it on the counter. $3 buys you 100 acres of rock, rattlesnakes, and rotten wood. Your name? Etta Sloan. He dipped his pen, scratched her name onto the document with a flourish, and sanded it dry. He pushed the paper toward her and swept the coins into a drawer. "Pleasure doing business with you, Miss Sloan," he said, the mockery plain in his voice. She took the deed, the paper dry and fragile in her hands. It felt impossibly light, yet it was the heaviest thing she had ever held. It was the first thing that was truly hers. She folded it carefully and placed it in her satchel, turning to leave without another word. The clerk was already laughing to himself, shaking his head as he returned to his ledger. She had just bought herself a ghost, a shelter made of memory and decay. It was nothing, and it was everything. What was she thinking? A girl of 19 with nothing to her name, buying a pile of rubble. Was it desperation, or did she feel something that everyone else had missed? What secrets can a place hold when left to the mercy of time and nature? Let us know what you would do in her shoes in the comments below. And be sure to subscribe for more stories of hidden strength and quiet courage. The mill had been waiting a long time for someone to listen, and Etta Sloan was finally on her way. As Etta stepped back out into the main street, the deed tucked safely away, the morning sun seemed harsher, the shadows deeper. The town, which had felt merely indifferent before, now felt actively hostile. Whispers followed her like burrs on a wool blanket. She heard the clerk's laughter echo from the office and saw 2 women by the mercantile stop their conversation, cover their mouths with their hands, and stare. She was the town's new fool, the subject of its morning gossip. She kept walking, her chin held high, her focus narrowed to the single task of gathering what few supplies she could afford with the change left in her pocket. A small sack of flour, a box of matches, and a cheap, sturdy knife. As she exited the general store, a large figure blocked her path. Silas Blackwood stood before her, his bulk filling the doorway, a gold watch chain glinting against his expansive waistcoat. His face was florid, his eyes small and assessing. He looked down at her, a sneer playing on his lips. "Well, well," he boomed, his voice carrying down the street. "If it isn't the little Sloan girl. I heard you came into an inheritance." He gestured vaguely toward the mountains. "Bought yourself a pile of rocks, did you? Following in your father's footsteps, it seems. A fondness for failed mills." The cruelty of his words was a physical blow. Etta flinched, the memory of her father's tired face, the shame in his eyes, rising hot and swift. She said nothing, merely clutched her small bag of supplies and tried to step around him. He shifted, blocking her again. "Let me give you some advice, girl," he said, leaning in, his voice dropping to a confidential, condescending tone. "Some things are best left to rot. That place is a money pit. Your father learned that the hard way. You'd be wise to just walk away, cut your losses." He smiled, a predator's smile. "Though I suppose you have nothing left to lose." She met his gaze then, and for a fleeting second, the quiet intensity in her eyes seemed to give him pause. She still said nothing. There were no words for the cold fury that was coiling in her gut. Silence was her only shield, her only weapon. She sidestepped him again, and this time he let her pass, his mocking laughter following her down the street. Her cheeks burned, but she did not run. She walked with a deliberate, measured pace toward the edge of town, toward the path that led into the woods. Just as the last buildings gave way to tall pines, a voice, quiet and cracked as old leather, spoke from the shadows of a covered porch. "The girl with the paper." Etta stopped and turned. An old woman sat in a rocking chair, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes dark and surprisingly clear. She was wrapped in a patchwork quilt despite the mildness of the day. Etta had not even noticed her sitting there. The woman, whom the townspeople called Elspeth and mostly avoided, was considered half-wheeled, a creature of the mountains, who only came to town for salt and thread. Elspeth's gaze was not pitying or mocking. It was knowing. She looked at Etta, then at the satchel where the deed was hidden, as if she could see right through the canvas. "They think the value is in the wood," the old woman said, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "But the deepest water runs under the stone." Etta stared, confused by the strange pronouncement. The woman simply nodded, once a slow, deliberate gesture, and turned her gaze back to the mountains. The conversation, if it could be called that, was over. Etta lingered for a moment, the woman's words hanging in the still air. "The deepest water runs under the stone." It made no more sense than her father's ramblings, yet it felt like a coin pressed into her hand, a thing of weight and value she did not yet understand. With a final uncertain glance at the unmoving figure on the porch, Etta turned and took the path into the forest, leaving the town and its judgment behind her. The real journey was about to begin. The path to the Blackwater Mill was less a path and more a memory of one. It wound upward from the valley floor, a faint track overgrown with ferns and choked by fallen branches. The air grew cooler, quieter, scented with damp earth and pine. The sounds of Hollow Creek, the smith's hammer, the rumble of wagon wheels, the voices of men faded behind her, replaced by the chatter of a squirrel and the sigh of the wind in the high canopy. Etta walked for more than an hour, her satchel growing heavier with each step. The land here was wilder, the trees older and thicker. She felt a profound sense of isolation, but it was not frightening. After the scrutiny of the town, the anonymity of the woods was a balm. Finally, she heard it, a low, steady murmur that grew into the rush of moving water. She followed the sound, pushing through a thicket of rhododendron, and then she saw it. The mill was a skeleton. It stood astride the fast-moving creek, a crumbling monument to forgotten industry. The great water wheel was locked in place, half submerged, its paddles furred with green moss and festooned with debris. Much of the roof had collapsed, leaving the upper floor exposed to the sky. The stone foundation was massive and dark, slick with moisture, but the wooden structure built upon it was a ruin of sagging beams and walls pocked with holes. It was worse than she had imagined. Far worse. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. The clerk's laughter, Blackwood's sneer, they were right. She had paid her last dollars for a pile of rot. The sun was beginning to dip below the ridge, casting long, distorted shadows that made the ruin seem even more desolate. A cool evening breeze stirred the leaves, and the first drops of a coming rain began to fall. Etta felt a familiar burn behind her eyes, but she refused to cry. Crying was a luxury she could no longer afford. She needed shelter, and this wreck was all she had. She circled the structure, looking for any part that might offer protection from the rain. On the side facing away from the creek, a low overhang, where a loading dock might have once been, provided a sliver of dry ground. The space was barely large enough for her to sit with her back against the cold stone foundation. As she huddled there, pulling her thin coat tighter, a movement in the shadows caught her eye. Two glints of yellow, low to the ground. A low growl rumbled from the darkness. A stray dog, its ribs stark beneath a matted coat of gray fur, had claimed this meager shelter first. It was as thin and lost as she was. It watched her, wary and defensive. Etta slowly reached into her satchel and pulled out the small loaf of bread she'd bought, her dinner for that night and breakfast for the next. She broke off a piece and tossed it gently onto the ground between them. The dog flinched but didn't run. It eyed the bread, then her, its growl softening to a whine. After a long moment it crept forward, snatched the bread, and retreated back into the shadows to devour it. Etta broke off another piece. This time the dog took it more readily. She ate her own small portion in silence. As the rain began to fall in earnest, a steady, drumming rhythm on the broken roof above, the dog crept closer, eventually settling just a few feet away. It laid its head on its paws and let out a long, weary sigh. Etta leaned her head back against the cold, damp stone of her new home. She was not entirely alone. She closed her eyes, listening to the rush of the creek and the soft breathing of the stray dog, and for the first time in a long time she slept. The ruin held them both in its broken embrace. The next morning, Etta woke to the strange, dappled light, filtering through the holes in the mill's roof. The rain had stopped, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet stone and decaying leaves. Her body ached from the cold, hard ground, but her mind was clear. The despair of the previous evening had receded, replaced by a quiet, stubborn resolve. This place was hers. It was her duty to see it, to know it, before she could declare it a loss. The dog was still there, curled in a tight ball. He lifted his head as she stirred, his tail giving a single, tentative thump against the dirt floor. She had no more bread to offer, but she gave him a soft word and a slow blink, a sign of peace she'd learned from her father for dealing with wary animals. She decided to call him Ash, for his gray coat and his appearance from the ashes of her own life. Leaving him to rest, Etta began her first true exploration of the mill. The ground floor was a cavern of debris. Rotted planks, rusted machine parts, and layers of silt and leaves covered everything. In the center of the vast room, like the heart of a dead giant, sat the millstone. It was a magnificent thing, a single, solid piece of French burstone, at least 4 feet in diameter and thick as a man's chest. It was not in its proper place. The massive wooden housing that should have held it, the ton, had splintered and collapsed, and the stone itself had shifted, coming to rest at a slight, unnatural angle on the floor. It was a symbol of the mill's complete failure, its very purpose broken and displaced. Etta spent the morning simply clearing a space, using a broken plank to scrape the muck and debris away from the center of the room. It was heavy, dirty work. Ash watched her, a silent, furry shadow. As she worked her way closer to the great stone, she began to notice something strange. The floor of the mill was mostly packed earth and rough-hewn flagstones, uneven and practical. But the area directly beneath the millstone was different. Here, the stones were flatter, more uniform, fitted together with a precision that was out of place with the rustic construction of the rest of the foundation. It was almost like a deliberate platform, a stage for the main event. She ran her hand over the surface. It was cool and smooth. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. The foundation. She knelt, peering closer at the giant millstone itself. It was covered in a fine layer of grime. Using the sleeve of her coat, she wiped at the curved edge of the stone, near the bottom where it met the peculiar floor, and there it was. Her first real clue, a small, faint carving, no bigger than her thumb, It was not a maker's mark, nor was it a random scratch from its fall. It was a deliberate shape, elegantly carved into the hard quartz of the birstone, a single five-pointed star. It was so faint, so unexpected that she almost dismissed it. Anyone else would have. But Etta had spent her childhood in a mill. She knew these stones. They were commodities, tools. They were marked for weight or origin, but never decorated, never personalized. A star. Why would anyone carve a star on the side of a millstone? It refused to fit. The precise stone floor beneath, the cryptic carving on the side. It was a discordant note in the ruined symphony of decay. She didn't understand it, not yet. But as she stood there, her fingers tracing the faint outline of the star, a flicker of something other than desperation sparked within her. It was curiosity. The mill had spoken its first word, and she was beginning to listen. Days bled into weeks. Etta's life found a new rhythm, dictated by the sun and the needs of the broken mill. Her first priority was shelter. She scavenged planks from the collapsed sections of the structure, painstakingly pulling out rusted nails, and began to patch a small corner of the roof over the main floor. It was slow, arduous work. Her hands, soft from a year of idleness and grief, quickly became calloused, then blistered, then calloused again. She learned the feel of the wood, the heft of the stones, the way the light moved through the space during the day. She and Ash developed a quiet partnership. He would follow her as she worked, a silent sentinel, and at night, they would share the warmth of a small, carefully managed fire she built in a makeshift hearth of stacked stones. He was her only companion, and his steady presence was a constant grounding comfort. Every day, her work would bring her back to the center of the room, to the mystery of the millstone. The strange, perfect section of floor and the star carved on the stone's edge became a focal point in her mind. She swept it clean daily, studying it from every angle. The words of the old woman, Elspeth, returned to her. The deepest water runs under the stone. Was it a literal warning about the creek or something more? One afternoon, driven by a frustration she couldn't name, she took the old crowbar she had found amidst the debris and tried to pry at the edge of one of the finely fitted flagstones beneath the millstone. She wedged the tip into a hairline crack and threw her entire weight against it. The bar groaned, but the stone didn't move. It was sealed, as if it were one solid piece. Defeated, she sat back on her heels, breathing heavily, her gaze falling once more upon the star carving. She traced its shape again, the 5 points, the clean lines. It was then that a memory, faint and dusty as old flour, surfaced in her mind. She was a little girl, sitting on a stool in her father's office as he worked on his ledgers. He wasn't just writing numbers. He was sealing a letter, and before he pressed his signet ring into the hot wax, he showed it to her. The signet was not the family initial, but a small, perfect star. "It's the miller's mark, Etta," he had said, his voice warm and proud. "Passed down from my grandfather. It means the work is true. It means it's ours." Her breath caught. It wasn't just a star, it was his star, her family's mark, a mark of ownership, of identity. She scrambled back to the stone, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't a random decoration. It was a sign, a message left by someone who knew the miller's mark. Her grandfather? Her great-grandfather? The labor of the past weeks had changed her. She was no longer just a grieving girl. Her hands had learned the language of the mill, and now her mind was beginning to understand its grammar. The star wasn't just a clue, it was a key. The floor wasn't just a platform, it was a lock. Her father's words and Elspeth's cryptic message began to converge into a single point of startling clarity. The foundation, the stone. She looked from the carving to the sealed floor, and a wild, incredible thought began to take shape. The treasure of the Blackwater Mill wasn't the structure itself, but something hidden deep within its heart, waiting for someone who knew the sign. The realization settled over Etta not with a crash, but with a profound and sudden stillness. The star was not on the stone, it was the key. She looked closer at the carving, her fingers tracing the outline with a new, trembling reverence. It wasn't just etched into the surface. There were faint, almost invisible seams around it. It was a separate piece, inlaid with masterful precision. Her knife. She retrieved the cheap, sturdy blade from her belt, its point honed sharp on her father's old whetstone. With the care of a surgeon, she inserted the very tip into one of the hairlines and gently, carefully began to pry. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with a faint click, the small stone star loosened. It came free in her hand, a solid piece of granite shaped and fitted perfectly. It felt warm, alive. As she lifted it out, she heard a low, grinding sound from below. Stone on stone. Her eyes darted to the floor beneath the great millstone. A single, large flagstone, the one she had tried and failed to move with the crowbar, had shifted, a dark crack appearing along its edge. It had a recessed hole, previously hidden, just large enough to fit her fingers. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. With Ash whining softly at her side, sensing her agitation, she knelt and pulled. The stone was heavy, but it lifted, pivoting on a hidden mechanism. Beneath it was not dirt or bedrock, but a dark, square cavity, lined with slate to keep out the damp. It was a hidden chamber, a stone safe. She reached for her lantern, her hands shaking so badly, it took 2 tries to strike a match. The flame caught, casting a warm, golden glow. She lowered the lantern into the opening. The light fell upon a tin box, dark and sealed with wax. It was an old biscuit tin, but it had been carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the elements. Time had stood still in this small, dark space. With painstaking slowness, she lifted the box out. It was heavier than it should have been. She set it on the floor and used her knife to break the brittle wax seal and pry open the lid. The first thing she saw was a deerskin pouch, tied shut with a leather thong. It was soft and worn, and when she lifted it, it was surprisingly heavy. She fumbled with the knot, her fingers clumsy with anticipation. She untied it and tipped the contents into her palm. It wasn't coins. It was a soft, glittering stream of gold dust fine as flour, shimmering in the lantern light. A fortune, a miller's fortune hidden away. Her breath hitched in a sob. But beneath the pouch was something else, something more important. It was another object wrapped in oilcloth, a document folded and protected. She unwrapped it carefully. The paper was old, the ink faded but still legible. At the top, in elegant script, it read, "Deed of trust and title for the Blackwater Creek Mill." The date was 1835. It was the original deed, but it was the papers tucked inside it that made her stop breathing. It was a ledger page and a signed, witnessed letter. The letter was a confession, written by a man named Alastair Finch, who described himself as the original partner of her great-grandfather, Elias Sloane. In a trembling hand, he detailed how a young, ambitious banker named Silas Blackwood had used threats and forgery to force him out, stealing the deed and creating a fraudulent chain of ownership that eventually led to the ruin of the Sloane family. Blackwood hadn't just foreclosed on her father. He had stolen the mill from their family 2 generations ago. It was all there. The proof, the truth. In the flickering lantern light, surrounded by the ruins of her family's legacy, Etta Sloane finally understood. Her father hadn't lost the mill. It had been stolen, and she, standing in its broken heart, had just stolen it back. Just as the enormity of her discovery settled upon her, the world outside began to change. The gentle afternoon light dimmed unnaturally, and the wind, which had been a soft sigh all day, began to howl through the gaps in the walls, a low, rising moan. A storm was coming. Not a simple rain shower, but one of the violent, fast-moving tempests that could swell the creek and turn the valley into a torrent. Etta quickly placed the deed and the gold dust back into the tin box, closed the stone lid of the secret chamber, and slid the great millstone back as best she could to cover the seam. This secret had kept for 50 years. It would have to keep for one more night. She had to protect her home. The first sheets of rain hit the patched roof like handfuls of gravel. The sky turned a bruised purple-black. Thunder cracked overhead, so close it shook the very stones of the foundation, and lightning bleached the interior of the mill in stark, momentary flashes. The creek was rising, its gentle murmur transforming into an angry roar. Water began to lick at the lower edges of the foundation, seeping in through the cracks. This was her test. The wild, desperate idea that had brought her here had borne fruit. But now, nature itself seemed intent on washing it all away. She could run, take the precious box, and flee to higher ground, leaving the mill to its fate. But as she looked around the ruin, at the small space she had cleared, the roof she had patched, the hearth where she and Ash had shared their warmth, she knew she couldn't. This wasn't just a ruin anymore. It was hers. She and Ash huddled near the small fire, which spat and hissed as stray drops of rain found their way down. The wind tore at her makeshift roof, and she heard a large section of rotted timber groan, and then crash down somewhere on the far side of the building. The storm was trying to reclaim the mill. In the midst of the gale's fury, a new light appeared, bobbing and faint through the curtain of rain. A lantern. It moved unsteadily toward the mill. A man's voice, desperate and thin against the wind, called out, "Hello, is anyone there? Help!" Etta grabbed her own lantern and went to the main doorway. A man was staggering toward her, half carrying a woman who was leaning heavily on him, while a small child clung to his leg. Their wagon, visible in a flash of lightning, lay on its side 50 yards away, one of its wheels shattered. "Our wagon, the axle broke," the man shouted over the storm. "My wife, the baby's coming soon, we need shelter, please." Etta looked at them, their soaked clothes, their terrified faces, the woman's obvious distress. Just weeks ago, she had been the one who was homeless, shelterless, at the mercy of the world. Now here in the heart of her ruin, she was the one who had shelter to offer. "Come in," she said, her voice clear and strong against the wind. "Hurry." She led them to the driest spot, near her small fire. She gave the woman her only blanket and brewed the last of her coffee for them. The family, whose name was Miller, looked around the cavernous, leaking space with wide, grateful eyes. It was a wreck, but it was a haven from the storm's rage. As the storm raged on, Etta sat with them, a quiet protector in her own broken castle. She was no longer just the inheritor of a secret. She was the steward of a sanctuary. The storm broke just before dawn. The wind gentled, the rain softened to a drizzle, and a pale, watery light began to filter into the mill. The Miller family had huddled together and slept from sheer exhaustion. Mrs. Miller was resting as comfortably as possible, her husband watching over her with a grateful, weary expression. The creek was still a torrent, but it had crested just below the main floor of the mill. Etta's home had held. When the family awoke, Mr. Miller, a carpenter by trade, couldn't stop thanking her. "You saved us, miss," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Truly, we'd have been lost out there." Before they prepared to hike back to town, he insisted on repaying her kindness. With Etta's help, he used the crowbar and some scavenged rope to brace a dangerously weakened support beam that the storm had nearly taken down. "It's not much," he said, wiping sweat from his brow, "but it'll hold you until you can fix it proper." When the Millers finally left, they promised to send someone back for their wagon and to tell everyone in town of the girl at the Blackwater Mill who had given them sanctuary. Etta watched them go, then turned her attention back to the tin box. It was time. She cleaned herself as best she could, put on her spare shirt, and with the precious deed and a small pinch of the gold dust tucked securely in her satchel, she and Ash began the walk back to Hollow Creek. The town felt different this time. Or perhaps she was different. She walked with a purpose that she lacked before. Her first and only stop was the county clerk's office. Mr. Abernathy looked up, a flicker of annoyance on his face, which quickly turned to surprise when she placed the ancient oilcloth-wrapped deed on his counter. I believe you have this on file as forfeit, she said quietly. But this is the original title. I'd like to register it. Abernathy scoffed, but he took it. He unrolled the document, his eyes scanning the old script. His expression began to change. He read the date, the signatures, the property description. He then pulled out his own ledger, the one with the forged chain of title. He compared them, his finger tracing the lines, his brow furrowed in concentration. The room was silent for a long time. "My God," he finally whispered, looking up at her. His derisive smirk completely gone, replaced by awe. "Where did you get this?" "It was in the foundation," Etta said simply. The news, combined with the Miller family's dramatic story of their rescue, swept through Hollow Creek like a flash flood. The girl who bought the ruin, the girl who weathered the storm, the girl who sheltered a family, the fool had become a figure of folklore overnight. Silas Blackwood heard the rumors. He saw Mr. Abernathy hurrying toward the sheriff's office with the deeds in his hand. Late that afternoon, Blackwood rode out to the mill himself. He found Etta calmly clearing debris near the water wheel. He dismounted, his usual bluster gone. His face was pale, his movements stiff. He looked at the ruin, then at the quiet, determined girl who was now its master. He saw the truth in her steady, unflinching gaze. He opened his mouth to speak, to threaten or bargain, but no words came out. He was a man built on a foundation of lies, and she had just shown everyone the bedrock beneath. Humbled and exposed, he turned without a word, mounted his horse, and rode away, a smaller man than the one who had arrived. The townspeople's whispers had not stopped, but their tone had changed. Laughter had become reverence. Mockery had turned to respect. Months passed. The vibrant green of summer gave way to the gold and rust of late autumn. The Blackwater Mill was no longer a skeleton. With the help of Mr. Miller and a few other men from town, paid fairly with a small amount of the hidden gold, the roof was fully repaired. New windows were set in the walls, and the main floor was cleared and swept clean. The great water wheel, its axle repaired and gears cleaned, now turned slowly in the current. It wasn't grinding grain yet. The massive millstone still sat silent in the center of the room, its secret kept by Etta. But its movement was a sign of life, a steady heartbeat restored to the valley. The legal battle had been quiet but decisive. The original deed, authenticated by experts from the state capitol, was irrefutable. Silas Blackwood's empire, built on a half-century of deceit, crumbled. He sold his assets, including the bank, and left Hollow Creek in disgrace, his departure as unceremonious as his reign had been arrogant. Etta Sloan was no longer the homeless girl. She was the rightful owner of the mill and the surrounding 100 acres. She was a landowner, a part of the community, her name restored and respected. In the warm light of a late afternoon, Etta stood on the newly built porch that overlooked the creek. Ash, now healthy and with a glossy sea, sat loyally at her feet, his head resting on her boot. The turning of the water wheel was a peaceful, rhythmic sound, a promise of work to come. A farmer on his way home from town paused his wagon on the nearby track. He tipped his hat. "Evenin', Miss Sloan," he called out, his voice full of genuine admiration. "You've built yourself a fine mill, a real fine mill." Etta watched the water churn and foam around the wheel, the setting sun glinting off its wet paddles. A small, quiet smile touched her lips. She had done more than repair some wood and stone. She had reclaimed a history, honored a legacy. She thought of her father, of his pride and his pain, and of the truth that had lain dormant for so long. She turned her gaze from the water to the solid stone foundation beneath her feet. "I didn't build a mill," she murmured, her voice soft enough that only Ash and the whispering creek could hear it. "I just remembered where the foundation was." Thank you for staying with us through Etta's journey to reclaim her past and build her future. This was a story about the quiet strength of remembering, and how the things we inherit are so often more than just property. If you were moved by her story of resilience and vindication, Let us know in the comments. And please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of hidden history and the power of the human spirit. We'll be back soon with another story waiting to be uncovered.